All right. Well, I think we're as ready as we can be for both this audience and our remote audience. Welcome everybody to our last regular meeting of the year. We will have coming up a celebration of all of the volunteer efforts and great work that's been done in December. At December 11th, is that? Yeah, thank you. Okay, and aside from that, we hope that you enjoy the holidays instead of sitting through a regular meeting. We think celebration is a little more appropriate for December. So we have with us tonight the Legislative Bureau Chief from Maine Public, Steve Mistler, with some observations about our election that we just completed. There are still some races being recounted, so it's not all settled yet, but we're very interested in what he has to say, and hopefully with all of his knowledge of goings on in Augusta can provide some insights for your questions as well afterwards. And I'll turn it over to Steve. Welcome. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Can you guys hear me okay? All right. This microphone's a little bit different than what I'm accustomed to. So my name is Steve Mistler. I'm just by way of background, I've been covering Maine politics since 2010. I started with the Lewiston Sun Journal, worked there for about 2 years before I went to the Portland Press Herald, and I was the Statehouse Bureau Chief for the Portland Press Herald up until 2016. And that's when I joined Maine Public Radio. I made a transition from print to broadcast, which was quite a challenge. And I'm still a little bit nervous around microphones, if that makes any sense at all, since it's been 6 years. I do have some prepared remarks. I will not bore you with those for too long. I'm really interested in the question and answer part of this event. And also, I'm just not accustomed to talking at people. I'm usually listening. So I'm going to go through some remarks. A lot of this will not be new to you, but I feel like the recap is sort of important to kind of figure out where we landed last Tuesday. So I just want to begin by reading a headline from a piece that I wrote almost a year ago today. And that headline read, "Why Maine Democrats Are Confronting a Brutal Electoral Landscape." The piece goes on to explain why the 2022 midterms were shaping up to be a potential disaster for Democrats. I'm pretty sure everyone in this room or listening at home has read some version of this type of analysis. Polls showed inflation skyrocketing to become the top concern for voters. There was a fundamental advantage that the party out of power, the Republicans, have almost in every single midterm election. And of course, the potential that the unpopular president would weigh down congressional and gubernatorial candidates alike. For Democrats, it was a grim assessment. It wasn't designed to be a prediction necessarily, but it definitely tried to give readers a sense of the challenges Democrats faced. And those challenges were numerous. Your governor, Janet Mills, was already engaged in a re-election contest with former Republican Governor Paul LePage, who had never lost an election. LePage had the full support of the GOP party apparatus, which had effectively cleared the field of any serious primary challengers for him. Republicans in the legislature had also pledged their support, which meant the legislative session effectively became a proxy battle for the upcoming election. And GOP legislators hammered on the governor's pandemic response. We really thought that was going to be a key issue in this race. And her vaccine mandate for healthcare workers, that was something that they rode pretty heavily. Their pressure campaign continued into the new year as they homed in on the issue of inflation and high energy costs. All the while, Republicans tried to frame Democrats and Governor Mills as somehow responsible for shrinking the reach of voters' paychecks. It seemed possible that the threats to the top Democratic ticket might also extend to legislative candidates. Republicans were eyeing control of at least one chamber of the state house. Full control was entirely within the realm of possibility. Now let's fast forward to a headline that accompanied a broadcast I was a part of the day after the election, last week. In Maine, election day was especially good for Democrats and bad for Republicans. I thought you might like that. And last week, it was undeniably good for Maine Republicans in particular. They maintained their trifecta in state government. They retained the governor's office, the House, and the Senate. Governor Mills vanquished her longtime nemesis, Governor Paul LePage, and she made it look easy. She and the Maine Democratic Party eviscerated LePage's rebranding effort, LePage 2.0. I'm sure you guys have heard that. On election day, Mills ran up the score in Portland. She dominated the surrounding communities that are generally favorable to Democrats, but not so much that Republicans can't compete there. Places like this. You can make a pretty good compelling case that Republican Senator Susan Collins won re-election in 2020 simply by building big margins in the 2nd Congressional District and holding her own in those communities, even taking a few of them. Governor Mills did not let that happen, and neither did Maine Democrats. She also won key battleground cities like Lewiston, LePage's hometown, and Waterville, where he was once mayor. She held her own in the 2nd Congressional District, so much so that LePage's overall support there decreased from his 2014 re-election campaign. It was an absolute rout and one that may end LePage's political career, at least in this state. Democrats' successes statewide were mirrored here in Lincoln County, where the party's candidates were successful in 10 of 12 contests. Is that right, Kelly? 10 of 12. Governor Mills also doubled her 2018 margin of victory in this county. Those wins here are important. Without them, Democrats would have had a hard time maintaining control of the legislature. Without control of the legislature, Democrats could have lost 2 other key positions: Attorney General, effectively the state's top attorney and prosecutor, and Secretary of State, which has the all-important task of administering elections. Democrats also swept both congressional races, a task that was supposed to be much harder because of the red wave. But the red wave never came. Today, it's Republicans, not Democrats, who are trying to figure out what went wrong. This assessment is not unique to Maine Republicans. It's happening all over the country at the national level. But the drubbing the GOP took here is uniquely devastating in its totality. Its plan to bring back its standard bearer, LePage, and attach legislative candidates to his coattails failed. This was a clear plan for that party. This is why LePage was at training sessions for for legislative candidates. The idea was to link them to him and his success. And it did not go well, as you know. Well, right, for you guys. That's right. Now the party faces a crisis of identity, talking about the Republicans, leadership, and potentially grassroots activism. I'll circle back to the Republicans' predicament in a minute, but I suspect the reason they're in this position is one of the primary reasons why the much ballyhooed red wave essentially became a Democratic rout. The activists in this room who talk to voters on a daily basis probably have a good sense of why this happened. But here's my best guess. My guess is best guess at an assessment. Let's begin with the issue that Republicans hope to ride into power: inflation and high energy costs. The GOP appeared to pin its hopes on the notion that all they needed to do was blame Democrats for these problems that voters would punish them for it. No solutions needed. But there were some early signs that this would not work out, especially for state level candidates. A public poll released last spring showed that inflation and the costs of goods were indeed worrying voters. This was their top concern. It was their top issue. But the poll showed something else too. Voters did not appear to be blaming Maine Democrats for this predicament. The governor's favorability was relatively unchanged from a previous tracking poll, and a generic ballot test showed that voters narrowly preferred a Democrat running for the legislature to a Republican. I remember interviewing the pollster about these findings, and he confirmed what I had observed, that there was a disconnect between voters' inflation concerns and who they were blaming for it. The pollster suggested that this could change over the course of a sustained GOP messaging campaign. He was pretty certain that that would happen. So that's what I watched for. In the meantime, the governor and the Democratic legislators quickly worked on a plan that might provide, or that did provide, Maine residents some relief from high prices. This plan centered on those direct payments, the $850 checks from the state that actually came from the state's budget surplus. Now, I don't know if those checks were on the minds of voters when they cast ballots this fall, but I'd argue that they were an important tool in blunting any backlash that might have befallen Mills and the Democrats. That's because it showed the voters two things: that Democrats in charge understood that inflation was hurting people, and also that they were trying to do something to alleviate the pain. I suspect former Governor LePage understood this effect too, which is why he attacked the inflation relief payments repeatedly during the campaign. He's basically said that Governor Mills was using them to buy the election. Either way, Governor Mills and the Democrats had something tangible to present to the voters. But the checks were not going to single-handedly solve Democrats' challenges. They were going to need some help. And on June 24th, the Supreme Court delivered it. The Dobbs decision that overturned Roe versus Wade was nothing short of a political earthquake. Democrats and abortion rights activists had for years warned that Roe could fall, and the conservative project to overhaul the Supreme Court made it abundantly clear that overturning Roe was a primary objective. But even during the contentious confirmation hearings for Judge Brett Kavanaugh, the prospect of an America without abortion access may have seemed like an abstract threat to some voters. That changed after Dobbs. Women were suddenly confronted with the prospect of having no say in the future of their pregnancies, and that those choices would be largely left to politicians, specifically state lawmakers and governors. In the 13 states with trigger laws, these are the laws that effectively would put abortion bans in effect as soon as Roe versus Wade was overturned, this future was immediately became the present. Other Republican-controlled states moved quickly to restrict abortion, in some cases criminalizing women who went to another state to get one, and sometimes outlawing exceptions for rape and incest. It was no longer to imagine a post-Roe world. It was here, and it had immediate and significant effects on the 2022 elections. Suddenly, Republican candidates, including LePage, a longtime abortion opponent, had to defend past statements and positions. The shockwaves reached deep down the ballot to legislative candidates. Suddenly, those questionnaires that GOP politicians filled out for the Christian Civic League of Maine and other anti-abortion groups were a potential liability, and they were. Still, there were some national pundits who questioned the electoral power of the abortion issue. They assumed that inflation, along with the fundamental midterm advantages that the GOP had this year, would still prevail with voters. Others framed abortion as a base motivator for Democrats, but of questionable utility in winning over independent voters. Voters in Kansas proved those pundits wrong. In August, voters in the deep red state overwhelmingly rejected an effort to remove abortion protections from their state constitution. It was a stunning result, but one that validated a slew of national polls that showed that outlawing abortion or severely restricting access is deeply unpopular with the American public. The campaign to protect abortion rights in Kansas also revealed a messaging hack for Democrats. By framing abortion rights as the rights of an individual against the power of politicians and the government, the issue had additional resonance for independent and some right-leaning voters. At the same time, something else happened. Former President Donald Trump continued to exert control over the National Republican Party. His stolen election lie had become a purity test of sorts for Republican candidates. But what Donald Trump wants isn't necessarily what most voters want. Moving on from 2020 and the chaos therein was perhaps an underappreciated factor in evaluating the dynamics of this year's election. I wish there was a way to quantify it. I'm just certain that there was an undercurrent there that affected how Tuesday turned out. And so too, perhaps, was the extremism exhibited by some of the GOP candidates. I'll never forget what my father told me a month before the election. My dad is a classic swing voter. He pays attention to politics, and he's deeply skeptical of one-party control. In October, he said, "I've always been a split ticket voter, but not this year." Excuse me just for a second. My father was voting for Democrats up and down the ballot. And I cannot overstate how rare and unusual that is. But back to the campaign trail. By Labor Day, the race for governor was in full swing, and so were the legislative contests. Democrats spent big to support their legislative candidates, and they unleashed a wave of attacks against LePage that were equal parts withering and effective. The state party took an active role in beating back LePage's rebranding exercise, constantly reminding voters of his past conduct and using his missteps and falsehoods from this year's campaign to frame him as essentially the same disruptive, divisive politician that he's always been. And I have to pause here with a bit of a confession. I was deeply skeptical of Democrats' ability to handle LePage this year. I watched them struggle for 8 years trying to take him down, or at least keep him in check. Nothing worked. He seemed to be coated in Teflon, and no matter the controversy, it just didn't matter. He just seemed to survive and sometimes thrive. But Democrats this year had a plan for LePage, and so did Governor Mills. You could see the governor's approach during the debates. She repeatedly challenged LePage's assertion about her record and his record. And she put him on the spot on abortion, forcing confused and conflicting answers at a time when voters demanded clarity. She also hammered a theme that I think was top of mind for a lot of voters: chaos. LePage would bring it, she said. He had before. It was what he was known for. Governor Mills also used the line that I think was very effective. Her opponent, she said, fought people, not problems. Beyond winning the rhetorical battles in the debates, I think the governor also won on style. She was poised, even when LePage was insulting her or calling her a liar, which he did repeatedly on the debate stage. One of the most intriguing photos was taken during the debates. It ran on the front page of the Portland Press Herald after the forum hosted by News Center Maine and the Maine State Chamber of Commerce. I think it was the second to last debate of the season. And it showed LePage sort of gesticulating from the lectern, but Governor Mills was also in the same frame because the lecterns were so close. And in that frame, you could just see her standing there with her eyes closed and her head tilted slightly back. It was a picture of restraint, and it was a defining moment in my view. In the end, that might be why those pesky swing voters were looking for a sense of calm, some normalcy, a break from the chaos and the conspiracies. Heading into Election Day, it was difficult to know exactly where everything stood. There was no public polling of legislative races, so there was no independent assessment of those contests. You guys were really the ones that had a best sense of what was going on there. There were polls of the governor's race, but it was unclear whether we could trust them. The polling miss of the 2022 U.S. Senate race loomed large. But as the results came rolling in on Election Day, it was pretty clear early on that this contest was headed for a wipeout. Turnout reports were high. There were anecdotal reports of heavy use of same-day voter registration, which can sometimes signal that the younger voters are turning out in droves. We'll find out more about that when we get some data from the Secretary of State, but I can't wait to see that, to see exactly where people are using the same-day voter registration law. And you all know the rest. An election that was supposed to be a bloodbath for Democrats turned out to be a night of celebration. The party protected 2 congressional seats. It protected its governor, and it protected its legislative majority. There are a lot of unknown reasons for why this happened. Certainly abortion was a factor. So was the fact that voters largely didn't hold Democrats responsible for inflation or the high price of gas. But I get a sense that something else was also at work in this election. Maybe voters like my dad, were not ready to reward the Republicans' dalliance with a former president who had tried mightily to overturn the 2020 election. Maybe they worried about the extremism that seems ascendant in some corners of the GOP. Maybe someday we'll get some definitive answers to those curiosities. I can't wait for them. But for now, here's what we know. Democrats fared better in the 2022 election than anyone predicted, defying history and the so-called fundamentals of a midterm election. That was true all across the country, but it was especially true here in Maine. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Steve. So we're open. I do have my chat up now. So if somebody wants to do that, and I've got a gallery open if people are interested in speaking from the Zoom. Do we have anyone in the room that would like to ask a question? Yes, sir.
Oh, they can hear me in Zoom too, I'm sure. So clearly here, one of our big races was our Senate race. That was a must keep for us, which we did keep. And I don't know if Cameron is on the Zoom tonight or not, but I'm curious, what were some of the other must-win races that you tracked in the legislature that we won that people weren't expecting us to win?
Well, that's a good question, because I think the races that I tracked, I wouldn't necessarily rule out Democrats as being competitive in those races. I'm thinking specifically of the Belfast race with Chip Roy, and is it Marianne Kinney, perhaps, I think, who was running against him. I can't remember the Republican's name. That was a key race. This was a key race. In some ways, the Auburn race, which is going to a recount, this is the Eric Brakey, Betty Ann Sheets contest. That's going to go to a recount. Brakey is leading that race at the moment, according to unofficial results, by about 128 votes, I think it is. I saw that as a key race too. And you could see the spending. This is one thing. This is how I usually can tell where the most competitive races are, is you look at where the outside groups, the party groups, the Democratic Senatorial Committee, for example, or sometimes other groups. If you just pull the data, you can see where which races they're targeting the most. They were targeting, this race was one of them, although it wasn't as high as, say, the Aroostook County race with Senate President Troy Jackson. $1 million in that race. I mean, a Senate district only has something like 30,000 people in it. Okay. $1 million in that race. That was a key race, obviously. They obviously wanted to defend, or in the Republicans' case, topple Senator Troy Jackson, Senate President. There was another one. Oh, there was the one in just outside of Augusta suburbs, Craig Hickman and Jeff Hanley, another key race, because those are pretty swingy districts. Same with this one. Well known, exactly. Yeah, Jeff Hanley was well known, so he was a formidable opponent. I mean, Craig is a really good candidate. He works really hard, and he's just very unique in the way he I think he appeals to a broad cross section of voters. You know, not so easily delineated by party affiliation. He just seems to have this sort of natural gravitas or something. But this was a rough contest for him. So those were the big ones that I watched. And I thought, I mean, generally speaking, Democrats did well. I mean, the only one that they didn't win that I thought they had to is this Auburn seat, which is going to a recount. I mean, 128 votes, it's a little bit hard to find votes in a recount with a margin that large, but it's still within the recount margin where the campaigns don't have to pay for it, which means there's a shot. There's a shot for the Democrat to overcome that deficit. So hope that answers your question. Yes, sir. Oh, okay. Can I hear it? Oh.
I was wondering if you could comment on Jared Golden's contest. I know it's not Lincoln County, but it's been interesting to all of us. Thank you.
Well, where to begin with that race and that candidate, right? Jared Golden is a unique politician, and I say that because he represents a very unique district. Now, when I started covering politics in 2010, that seat was held by Mike Michaud, and he'd held it for years. And in fact, it wasn't until he was convinced to run for governor, he'd probably still be there, honestly. And so Golden, I don't even know really where to begin with him, because he is such an orthodox Democratic candidate in so many ways. I mean, if you listen to his messaging in the home stretch of the election, he almost sounded Republican. He was attacking the Biden administration. He was attacking the Democratic leadership in Congress. And he was attacking spending bills, the American Rescue Plan, which is a pandemic relief proposal. He was the only Democrat in Congress to vote against that. I'd argue that that actually benefited him politically in his race, because he was able to say, look, I'm not spending all this money that you guys are worried about up here. You know, I'm actually putting a stop to it. The other thing that he did is that he's voted against House Speaker Nancy Pelosi for leadership twice. Now, if you've watched Republican campaigns in this state, especially in the 2nd district, the thing that they hammer on is spending and Nancy Pelosi over and over and over. But by voting against the rescue plan and also helping to scuttle Biden's Build Back Better initiative, he effectively disarmed those attacks. So they basically had to try to say in their ads that he was just faking it, that he wasn't really, against this big spending. He was in lockstep with the Democrats who controlled Congress. And therefore that's all they really had. That's all they had. They tried this gas tax attack. It didn't work. I remember early on last year, they tried to blame him for the proliferation of brown-tail moths. I'm not kidding. They really tried to do that. And they were linking this to this bill in the legislature when, of course, he came from the legislature. He was a member of leadership for a period of time. A bill that would have provided something like, I don't know, $50,000 to communities affected by brown-tail moths for remediation. That's what they had in their, in their arsenal. So they just never really had it. And I think the other problem that they had was that Bruce Poliquin, the Republican candidate, he never really galvanized Republican support in that district. You could see that in the endorsements. He didn't get the endorsements of the Fraternal Order of Police. That was a big deal because he wants to run on crime and he wants to run on the border and that sort of thing. And he couldn't get that endorsement, and that was a big deal. So was the non-endorsement by the Sportsmen's Alliance of Maine, which is a huge deal. That's a big get for candidates, especially Republican candidates. He didn't get that. And so, it was just clear to me. I mean, there were a lot of, if you asked me about the governor's race and how that was going to turn out, I said, I don't know, who knows? It's LePage has never lost, Governor Mills is a formidable campaigner. She's also really good on the stump, or in debates, especially knows how to turn a phrase, all that stuff. She'll certainly have financial support, but I don't know. I don't know how that's going to shake out. But in the 2nd congressional district race, I never had. I didn't. And it was because the type of politician that Golden has made himself to be, and also the type of campaign he was running, and also the fact that Bruce Poliquin had never consolidated that GOP support. Think about the primary that he ran. He had a primary opponent, Liz Caruso. Liz Caruso had no money to her campaign. She couldn't run any ads. And nobody really knows who she is, except if they were paying very, very close attention to the CMP corridor fight, because she was an activist that fought against the corridor. That's really where she made her name. Nobody knew who she was. She got 40% in a Republican primary against Bruce Poliquin. That to me said everything, that he was in trouble. And, the only question that I had about Jared Golden was whether or not he had angered Democrats so much with either his rhetoric or his votes. Because there were times where, again, he was kind of almost rubbing it in the nose, right? And so or at least that's the way it appeared. And so that was the only thing I worried about for him, is whether or not he was going to lose Democratic support. Maybe they wouldn't turn out for him. But I think if that happened, he made up for it with independent voters.
There's a question in the chat. Sometimes it seems like Republicans play hardball and Dems play softball. Do you agree with that general assessment? And do you think that was the case this time?
This time, no. I was actually thinking about this today, because Well, Republicans definitely play hardball. And certain candidates like LePage, Trump, they play out of bounds, right? And the Democrats have always struck me as a party that likes the rules, written or otherwise. And if that is your terms of engagement, right, in a campaign, then somebody like LePage has a natural advantage because he's willing to do and say things that Democratic candidates won't. They don't like, Democratic candidates don't like to be called out for lies. They don't like to be called out for falsehoods. They want to be right for the most part, generally speaking. And I think because of that, the party apparatus, whether it's this one or, the national party or whatever, they generally try to stay above the fray. And they do that, I think, at risk of just getting beat up from below. And, because sometimes you have to respond. And I think that was one of the things that Governor Mills did with LePage. She definitely picked her spots, which I think is really important, because if all you're doing is kind of bickering with the other guy or the other woman, you can end up sort of alienating everybody. But she definitely picked her spots with him. And I think that was very, very effective, at least on the debate stage, excuse me.
And else with a question? Sure. I'll give you.
Okay.
So Steve, certainly in the District 2 races now, ranked choice voting has been integral to the outcome. I wonder if you detect or foresee any future in which we'd have ranked choice applied to all of our electoral seats, including governor.
Well, that depends on the legislature, frankly, because what's preventing ranked choice voting from being used in gubernatorial contests, general election. They can use it in the primaries, right? What's preventing that from happening right now is the Supreme Court. It wasn't a ruling, it was an opinion. So that opinion has sort of been, it's basically acted as a quasi ruling because people don't want to challenge it, right? Anyway, the Maine law court essentially ruled that ranked choice voting cannot be used. It violates the state constitution. If that is true, and I believe it is, because this conflict was flagged before the referendum actually took place, and the organizers of the ranked choice voting campaign just said, we'll fix it on the back end, basically. The problem is that in order to amend the Maine Constitution, you have to clear two key hurdles. The first one is probably the most difficult, and that means that you need a supermajority, 2/3 support of the House and Senate to pass a constitutional amendment. And then it goes to voters. Now, if it got to voters, it probably would pass, I think. It may not be as decisive as a majority as it got when it initially passed in 2016, but I think it would certainly pass. I think it's got a chance. The problem is that even though Democrats control the legislature, they don't have that supermajority. They haven't had it, and they won't have it for the next 2 years either. And the other issue is that where ranked choice voting initially was sort of a byproduct, there was a bipartisan support for it. That's almost gone. Republicans have really rallied around the idea of opposing it. I mean, they were threatening, if they had taken power, to repeal the law. They wanted to get rid of it because they think it's, they don't like it. They want basically a first past the post system that has benefited them in a lot of ways because of the third party candidate in statewide elections, which has not been a factor recently, but it was obviously in 2010 and 2014. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I just think it would take a fundamental rethinking of ranked choice voting, I think, by Republicans and that are willing enough to send the issue to voters. I don't see that happening anytime soon. So you're going to have to wait for a supermajority, I think.
Thank you. I feel really good about what happened in Maine, and probably less so about what happened across the nation, even though it was a good result, because there were millions and millions of people who voted for election deniers and the Trump supporters. So, and I don't feel like that's going away. But in Maine, what do you think is going to happen with the Republican Party with LePage out of the picture? Do you think they've learned a lesson? Do you think they'll work together, or is it going to be the same old for the next 2 years at least?
Well, that's a great question. I don't have a good answer, but I can tell you what I've observed and what I think, a couple of different scenarios are. It's important. Let me just back up for a second. So it's important to remember just how strong of a grip Paul LePage had on the Maine Republican Party. When he was elected in 2010, that was not the case. He and his people, his team, essentially remade the party in his image in a lot of ways. People who were, I don't know, maybe a little bit worried or wary of him, they didn't really remain in the party for much longer. They were essentially excommunicated, or they just quit because they could see the writing on the wall. And so him losing this, well, here's the other thing. Sorry, I'm jumping around. So when he completed his second term at the end of 2018 and he left office in early 2019, he and his people put in place basically a plan to run for re-election this year. That plan essentially revolved around the idea of him becoming involved in legislative candidate trainings. He was involved in activist trainings. And so his sort of hold on the party strengthened, even, yes. Yeah, he came back periodically. He really never left. He really didn't leave. He definitely resided in Florida, and he was a Florida resident for a time, but he was coming back here often. He was on conservative radio constantly. And he was showing up for speaking engagements as well. And so what I'm trying to say is that party is his party. It's his party and it's Trump's party. And by him losing the way he did, and most likely exiting, I would assume. I mean, I'm not sure if he's left the house in Edgecombe or not, or if he's went back to Maine, I'm not sure. That leaves a huge power vacuum in that party. And the way I see it is that Republicans can go two routes. They can go and try to go maybe more moderate way, or but I just don't know if those people are around anymore, honestly, because again, a lot of them were excommunicated from the party. I mean, think about Kevin Ray. He was a Senate president in 2011 and 2012. He and LePage fought constantly, and it got worse when Trump became a factor, or, when Trump was elected president. Kevin Ray is not really involved in the Republican Party anymore. I mean, if you look at the campaign trail, he was actually endorsing Jared Golden, and he was doing events with Janet Mills. Okay. So, so these people are gone in some way, and I don't know how you bring them back. And so that leaves the question of which way do they go? Do they go deeper into this other thing that we've seen, more Trumpist, if you will? Do they go that route? There are certainly activists in the Republican Party and ancillary to that are calling for exactly that. They didn't think LePage was, to use their words, mean enough. They didn't think LePage was his same old self. They did not like this LePage 2.0 business. They thought that, if only he were his old self, he would have, captured the old magic and destroyed Janet Mills. So there's that line of thinking exists in that party. You can see it all the time, whether it's in the social media or just on conservative radio or whatever. So I don't know the answer to your question, but I can tell you that they have basically two directions, and I don't know which one they're going to take. I think to moderate is a hard thing to do. You're essentially building from the ground up, I think. And to go the other way is to go deeper into the wilderness, I think, in this state. I really do. We'll see what they decide to do. Maybe it's some combination of the two things, but they need a leader, and they don't have one right now because that leader had been Paul LePage.
So I've got a question. And there's also another question in the chat. We'll get to in just a moment. In the face of more attempts to promote the big lie and use mis and disinformation, what do you feel is the duty of legitimate news organizations?
Call it out every time and identify the election deniers. We've done that repeatedly. We made a point to ask LePage, for example, what if he would accept the results of the election. He sort of laughed at it, said it was a dumb question, right? But he did, right? He did accept it in his way. He did accept the results ultimately, and you know, I don't think he ever congratulated Janet Mills, but that's not necessarily a requirement. I think just accepting the results will settle for that, the American public. But yeah, I think it's absolutely the press's duty to call out election denialism. It's absolutely corrosive to our democracy. That is not an opinion. That is not a partisan view either. That is a fact. And I worry about that a lot because I happen to like this democracy because I'm protected as a member of the press, and it means a lot to me. So we have, as members of the press, have a vested interest in making sure that this kind of stuff is called out, and we will continue to do that.
First of all, thank you for that. Next question it is about the chance of eliminating the antiquated electoral college and permanently respecting the popular vote. And there's also a comment that it should cease all the gerrymandering strategy.
Well, on the electoral college thing, I mean, again, it's a similar situation to ranked choice voting, except we're talking about, in this case, the United States Constitution. It's a high bar, and you know, Republicans have benefited from the electoral college. They hold, I don't remember what they hold now in state legislative races or legislatures post Tuesday. Democrats gained some ground nationwide, by the way. You guys are part of that. It's going to be hard. You know, it has that movement has to originate in state legislatures. And it's hard for me to envision a future without an electoral college at the moment. I know that's probably not a satisfactory answer, but just being honest.
Who do you think is going to run for the Senate in 2024?
As to 2024, I don't know. Now, the big key here is whether or not Senator Angus King wants to run for re-election. And here's what I know about that. He loves it there. He loves being in the U.S. Senate. And I think that if his health is good, he might seek another term. I wouldn't be surprised if he did. If he doesn't, well, I mean, that's a free-for-all. I just don't know. I mean, I don't know who the Democrats would put up. I would imagine there would be a competitive primary. And if that's the case, that raises all sorts of questions. Does Shelley Pingree want to take a stab at it? Does her daughter, who's in the Mills administration, Hannah, who was a former Speaker of the House? That's certainly a possibility. Does Jared Golden or Troy Jackson? I mean, Troy Jackson, it would certainly be a pretty good statewide candidate. Jared Golden, perhaps. Who knows? Now, Jared Golden would have to come back to where you guys all are, right? I think, in order to pull that off. But, you know, political transformations are not, they're not unusual. And I don't think his would be that hard, honestly. He would certainly wouldn't be as hard as the one that LePage tried to pull off. So I think that top of mind, that's who I'm thinking of. Republicans, I don't know. I just don't know, because I don't know where the bench is there. You know, I see, well, one person I think of sometimes who would be a formidable candidate. I just don't know what his standing is in the Republican Party anymore, is Rick Bennett. Yep. Former chair of the Republican Party. He's decided to get out of that and become a state senator representing he lives in Oxford, so but he's representing part of Oxford County. Huge tribal advocate. He's in favor of this public power initiative. He believes in climate change. He drives a Prius. Okay. I mean, this guy he is very unusual in terms of the, the Republican archetype. And he's incredibly charismatic. So he would be formidable. I don't know if he'd run as a Republican. I don't know. I mean, he identifies as one now. Hard to say. I don't even know if he harbors that ambition. I just throw his name out there because I can't think of anybody else. And I think he'd be a good candidate.
I understand that legislators were in the State House today.
Yes, that's right.
Um,
Yep, that's right. Democrats were in the State House today.
Okay. And did you have a chance to find out anything about what the priorities are likely to be for the Democrats this session?
No. They're going to have priorities that are thrust upon them, though. And that is energy costs, these electric, these new standard offer rates that are coming out to see through CMP and Versant are they're going to crush people. And the state's got to try to do something about it. Home heating oil is another big problem. So you have a lot of issues that are top burner, that are emergencies, that are probably going to jump the line in terms of priorities for whether it's a Democrat or Republicans, because in some cases we're talking about a crisis. So I would expect that that's the stuff you're going to see and hear about the most about in the beginning.
That sounds like an answer.
It's the
Me,
best one
it
I have.
Any other questions from the room? It is, do you anticipate Governor Mills would cede any ground on tribal sovereignty, given that there is political room to breathe and the lead sponsor of the bill that passed last session is now speaker, and there is support in both chambers? For example, would she let another bill that passes become law without her signature if she felt she couldn't sign it? Or do you think she will hold fast to her defense of the state's interest, even if the state arguably has more to gain by recognizing Wabanaki sovereignty?
That's a great question. I don't have a good answer, except to say that it's been my observation that the governor's resistance to the sovereignty issue is not a political calculation. It's not. I don't believe that it is. I believe that, and I think this may have been a sort of a function of her time as Attorney General, when the state and the tribes were often at odds on legal issues. And so I think that that's how she sees this issue, through that lens. And it's, the difficulty that we've had in trying to sort of penetrate her rationale for opposing this is that sometimes her responses, while they're lengthy, she explains her positions. It's just that they feel abstract. You know what I mean? Like she's wary or worried about scenarios that feel abstract, I think, to the public. And so I don't know, maybe, I mean, the most politically expedient thing for her to have done would have been to sign that bill last year, right? Or this year, earlier this year. Was it this year? Yeah, this year. That would have been the politically expedient thing to do, because the Democrats, as a party, are very supportive. What else you got?
We've been tough on the Republicans tonight, and I just would love to get your take on, if you were going to just take a moment and look at the Democratic Party and say, okay, you got a great night, you had a great campaign. Obviously, the results were fabulous for the Democrats, but if you were to take a step back or two and just reflect a little bit on, well, there's some learnings here for the Democrats, perhaps. What would those be, and what would your cautions be for the Democrats moving forward?
Yeah, that's a great question, Dan. It really is. I've thought about this a lot too, because I think there may be a tendency, especially in Augusta, for the euphoria of this win to get to some people's heads. And when that happens, you can overextend, and as a result of that, you can end up angering voters if you get too far afield. And that doesn't matter if it's left or right. I think voters in this state, generally speaking, want moderation, honestly, for the most part, with some exceptions. And I think Democrats would do well to pursue that tack, because if they kind of veer off into I don't even know what I can't even think of a good policy that would to use by way of example. But if they veer off too far left, I think they could find themselves in trouble pretty quickly, and they could, essentially help resuscitate the Maine Republican Party just by doing that. I think a good example of that would be, and it wasn't really even a leftist quote unquote initiative, but look about 2009 and the tax overhaul that the Democrats who controlled the legislature at the time passed. And essentially what that was is essentially what LePage attempted to pass in 2014, which is essentially a big income tax cut paid for with an expansion of the sales tax. And Republicans had a field day. I firmly believe that voter or the income tax or that tax overhaul really helped pave the way for the red wave that hit in 2010 when Democrats lost their majority and Republicans had a trifecta in Maine for the first time in decades. And I think that's what you have to be wary of. That was a legislative initiative. And I think it single-handedly brought back a Republican Party at that time was in the wilderness. I don't know if they were as bad off as they are right now in this moment, but they were bad. They were in trouble. And I think Democrats would do well to not go down that path, not necessarily on tax reform or anything like that. Just, do not push a suite of policies that could get them in trouble. If they don't do that, I think they'll be in pretty good shape.
Holly, did you want to unmute? Have a question?
I did. Hello. And yes, I was in Augusta all day. And we, I don't know if you talked about, we did elect our speaker and House Majority and Assistant Majority Leader. We had House Majority Leaders, Maureen Moteri and Kristen Cloutier as our Assistant Majority Leader. It was a very productive day. I just wanted to weigh in on the 2024 discussion. I think that there were some cautionary tales that played out in certain areas of the state that were somewhat unexpected. We were very, very fortunate that in Lincoln County, we worked incredibly hard and we have a great slate of representatives and a senator, and something we should all be very proud of and excited about. But the cautionary tale, where some of my colleagues in the House experienced some full-on attacks. I know that my race was slated early on, that this was going to be one of the seats they were coming after, and we were prepared for that. And I think there was a couple of reasons why that didn't play out the way that they had planned to. But some of my colleagues did experience, and they used certain legislation that they had either sponsored or voted on as part of the attack. And when I say attack, they were like daily mailers. A lot of them came from one particular PAC. It really did impact some of the races in a very negative way. In two of them, my colleagues did get reelected, but it was very close, closer than we would have wanted. So I think there were a lot of lessons learned this year and 2024. The cautionary tale is decisions we make. We have to be very careful and weigh those carefully, and as if 2024, because it is really right in front of us. And that's my takeaway from this past election. And again, incredibly, incredibly grateful that we have all seats but one in the House, and we have our Senate seat. There's so much for us to celebrate, but never to lose sight of the fact that 2024 is staring us down. And it's going to be tough.
Can I ask you a quick question while you're
Sure.
What was the legislation that the mailers targeted? Was it the carbon tax bill from 2019?
No, it was the decriminalization
Yep.
bill, the decriminalization of some scheduled drugs, which has, if you remember during the debate, Steve, Paul LePage kept saying that we passed it and that we legalized fentanyl, which was not even, that none of that is true, but it was a decriminalization bill that was vetoed, so it never happened anyway. But that was one. And there was a second one, and I'm trying to remember what it was because I wasn't included in the attack, but it was the decriminalization. And I don't remember the other one, but they really hammered on that. Like the flyer would have said, Holly Stover wants to wants your kids, put fentanyl in your children's hands.
Yeah.
That was that sort of messaging.
Yeah,
And they had the
that's-
colored pills on, like they've been using on TV, which don't really exist.
Yeah, that's a good example. I mean, criminal justice reform and, descheduling or decriminalizing certain drugs. Dicey. It really is. I mean, I think, there's generally a sense that, doing that is good for reducing prison population and giving people a chance and that sort of thing. But it is ripe for being used in an election. Yeah, no doubt about it. I mean, the fentanyl issue that Holly mentioned is a really complex, very complex. It's hard to, and that's the danger, honestly, is it's hard to defend. It's hard to defend. I mean, LePage was wrong in his assertion overall, but there was a change. And to explain what that change is, once you're explaining and you're into the weeds about legalese and this and that, you're in trouble. Yeah, you're in trouble. So.
I just think it's good for us all to prepare and take the lessons learned from the way in which things got twisted. Almost like the arrows got twisted around and pointed back at us. So just really thoughtful. I'll be very thoughtful the next 2 years about the things I decide to do.
Yeah, I was amazed. It still sticks in my mind one day speaking with someone at the door about the problem with substance abuse and addiction and how many lives are lost to that. And his response was, if my son were addicted to that, I'd shoot him. And so, I kind of figured, first of all, wow, what do you say to that? But certainly isn't going to help them survive it. And so we talked about, this is family. And eventually he softened on that a bit, just by making him reflect on the relationship and who's there for you and things like that a bit. But yeah, it's amazing how some people are so hardline on something which is it is a medical issue, and it is a disease to be addicted to something. So in any case, are there further questions from the floor or from Zoom? Kelly was just asking if there are any parting thoughts from Steve on things today.
No, but thank you for having me. This is great. I love to just talk to people, especially people who are doing the doors, talking to voters, that sort of thing. I love to hear what your observations are. And I'm really thankful that you guys invited me to be here. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for coming, Steve. All right. That was wonderful. And likely we'll be inviting you back after another couple years from now or later. It's wonderful to have your insights on what's going on. Thank you.